How did the war over teaching atoms and molecules to elementary students begin? My name is Rebecca Woodbury, and I have a PhD in biophysical chemistry and a master's in curriculum and instructional design. You may not be aware, but today in the United States, elementary students are not allowed to learn about atoms and molecules in classrooms. I know this because I tried to get a paper published in an education journal from the National Science Teachers Association, or NSTA. And although the paper wasn't about atoms or molecules, it was about digital storytelling, the paper was rejected. It was rejected because of the books I used. I used books describing atoms, molecules, and chemical reactions, and this, they said, violated the assessment boundary for the next generation science standards. More on standards in a minute. This bothers me because science education continues to fail our students. In 2018, the ACT Science Readiness Benchmarks are already shockingly low. And in 2022, they drop yet again. And in 2023, only 1 in 5 high school students are ready for college-level science courses. Also in 2023, a survey noted that 62% of students aged 12 to 18 would consider a future career in science. We are hopelessly failing the majority of students who want to pursue STEM careers. One easy and possible fix is to just let kids learn the actual science, including the vocabulary and basic concepts they need for upper-level science courses. It's just common sense. We need to create instructional materials that introduce fundamental science concepts, like the atom, to students in a sequence they can understand. It's not difficult with good instructional design, and that's what I did. But books like mine can't be used in U.S. public schools. So how did this happen? When did atoms and molecules become bad words in the elementary grades? And what historical or educational factors contributed to the perception that atoms and molecules are taboo topics in elementary science classrooms? Well, it more or less started with Jean Piaget. Jean Piaget was a Swiss psychologist, and in the 1920s, he, by observing his 3 children, developed a theory of cognitive developmental stages. Piaget believed that these stages occur in a fixed order, and that no stage can be skipped. In this framework, development is needed before learning. In other words, you have to reach a stage of development before you can learn things like atoms. But it wasn't until the 1960s or so that educators began to take notice of Piaget's theories. Because Piaget's stages provided a framework for understanding how children's thinking evolves, educators began to design curricula and instructional methods that aligned with these stages. And because the atom is considered an abstract concept, curricular materials for elementary students were not developed and do not include discussions of atoms and molecules. So while Piaget's theory remains highly influential in education, by the 1980s and 1990s, some of his specific claims about cognitive stages came under criticism based on new research. Studies showed his theory underestimated children's abilities. It was criticized for being too rigid regarding age norms and the fixed sequencing timing of stages. He ignored the influence of social interaction, culture, and individual differences on cognitive development. And his research sample was limited mostly to his own children and others from a specific socioeconomic context. Today we know much more about how children learn. We know that language, culture, and social learning that Piaget downplayed are critical to learning. We also know that information processing models provide alternative explanations for how children acquire and process and use knowledge. In addition, brain imaging and other cognitive neuroscience research has expanded understandings of biological mechanisms underlying cognitive development. And neo-Piagetian theories have modernized Piaget, and with the view that cognitive development is much more continuous and gradual rather than occurring in discrete stages. Today, we know that learning is less linear than Piaget described, and children are capable of much more sophisticated understanding of abstract ideas. Yet the books haven't changed, and the perceptions that we must keep atoms and molecules out of the elementary classroom prevail. So what gives? Well, to find the answer to this question, we must dig a little deeper. We need to switch gears a little bit and discuss learning progressions. Learning progression is a map that describes the sequence of steps to take to learn any given topic. Learning progressions became a thing in educational circles in the early 2000s and started to take off around 2005. Learning progressions set the stage for the design of curriculum and instructional materials and the content found in K-12 standards. In 2006, a group of psychologists and educators put together an extensive description for a learning progression for matter and atomic theory. In their paper, they cite Piaget 6 times and use his theory to argue that K-5 students should focus on macroscopic properties of matter, like texture, weight, and size and color, with the concept of atoms being delayed until middle school or even high school. In addition, they cite Piaget's papers from the 1960s and 1970s to justify why, in the lower grade levels, they use weight instead of mass to discuss how matter is conserved. Because, of course, to use the concept of mass, you have to talk about atoms. However, this is just blatantly wrong. Weight is not a property that is conserved. Mass is conserved, but weight is not. Weight depends on gravitational force, so it's just wrong to tell kids weight is conserved. But because of this learning progression and the rigid adherence to Piaget's developmental stages, textbooks provide students with inaccurate information to this day. Not only are the textbooks wrong, but the Next Generation Science Standards, NGSS, which was spearheaded by the National Science Teachers Association, NSTA, and supported by the National Research Council, the NRC, determine what goes in textbooks and ultimately what is taught in public schools. The NGSS states that even in grade 5, mass and weight are not distinguished and no attempt is made to define the unseen particles or explain the atomic scale, so no atoms. All states, with the exception of Florida, had either fully adopted the NGSS or have modified their own standards based on the NGSS. The NGSS, in effect, bans all students below 5th grade from learning about atoms, molecules, and mass in public school classrooms. And today, public schools cannot buy books that don't align to the NGSS. But surely all of this work is backed by research, right? They tested this learning progression in classrooms, right? They found that students learn about matter and then atoms effortlessly by starting with properties of matter and waiting to learn about atoms until later, right? The new science standards were tested too, weren't they? They did some pilot studies to show that they were effective, right? Actually, no. Smith and her colleagues note on page 26 of their paper that this is just a possible rather than an actual learning progression. First, they don't have evidence that this is the progression most students actually take, and that their progression represents a conjecture about a coherent possible path based on existing literature. Second, they do not assume that this is the only sensible or coherent path that might be taken or constructed. And they argue that if multiple alternative paths were outlined by others, then one could research the trade-offs in different approaches. Finally, they acknowledge that many students do not actually make it through the progression. And the standards were never tested. They were created and within 2 years published and provided to the public, without doing any research to determine their efficacy. So let me get this straight. We have standards and curriculum materials that are created based on a hypothetical learning progression that is based on outdated research about what kids can and can't learn. But we can't replace the books because anything outside this progression doesn't align with the standards, and we can't get any research papers published by the NSTA that use materials about atoms and molecules. There is nothing wrong with learning progressions or standards. They are useful tools to guide instruction. It only becomes a problem when those standards and learning progressions serve to limit what students are allowed to learn in classrooms. So why does this matter? Well, because simply put, most kids can't make the jump. The step between what students are limited to learn by grade 5 and what they need to know leaving high school is too big of a leap. Many adults I talked to had dreams of being a doctor or a veterinarian or a geneticist, but they couldn't pass their college-level science classes, so they dropped out. Remember an earlier slide, 62% of 12 to 18-year-olds want to pursue STEM careers, and yet fewer than 20% of graduating seniors can pass college entrance exams. But what if we were to actually acknowledge that what we have been doing and continue to do is not working? And why, if there are other possible learning progressions that might work better, aren't we using them or at least trying? Well, it would undermine all of the many years we have invested in teaching kids about science in this one particular way. And we would have to toss out the new science standards, or at least rethink them. And we would have to redesign all elementary science curriculum, and then redesign all middle school science curriculum, and oh, yes, high school science curriculum too. And then we would have to retrain the teachers and retrain the professors who train the teachers. And of course, the esteemed institutions and nonprofit organizations would lose control of what books get inside classrooms and ultimately what students can learn. Or we could just let the kids read the books and if they want, learn about atoms and molecules and mass in the elementary grades right from the start. And this would, by the way, help them do better in high school and college by giving them both the confidence and foundation they need for more advanced science classes. Let's free the atom, and let's let schools buy better science books.